Hi, I'm John Doe, and welcome to my drum and bass production course for the DNB Academy. My real name is João Fragoso, and I've been making music for more than 15 years, which most of that time was under my previous alias called Frags. After endless hours on the road, more than 50 releases, and the creation of my own label called Surveillance Music, John Doe was born as a culmination of all those years of experience and hard work. On this course, you will see me build the track from the ground up. You'll learn how to design your own drums, your own basses and synths, while mixing all these elements as we go. All the files, presets and templates will be available in this pack, so you can either mimic these processes or reverse engineer them so you can take the most out of these tools.
Hi guys, this is Severity. In this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how I've made my track, my latest track called Crush. So before we get started, let's check out what the tune sounds like. Alright, so that's pretty much the tune. It gives you a feel for it. In this video, I'm going to start showing you the samples that I've used, the main samples that I used for this tune. Then we're going to go through how the drums were put together. Then we're going to talk about the bass patch that I made using ABLETON's operator built-in synth. And following that, I'm going to talk a bit about how I've processed the vocal and instrumental samples, and also some of the effects and stabs that are in there. And finally, I'll take you through how I've used my referencing technique for the final mixdown. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started with the samples that were used. So this track is mainly made up of really just 4 samples, and I've compiled all of them here in their raw form, just to give you an idea what sort of material, the raw materials that we worked with. So the first one is a bit of a jazzy instrumental loop. Let's solo that track first. So the second sample is a vocal sample.
Who is the sense that you give me, baby? Who is the sense that you give me?
So I've chopped and rearranged that sample a little bit throughout the arrangement. Then there's a drum loop that I picked up whilst auditioning samples online, and this one I thought was really interesting, as it would lend itself nicely to sort of a minimal drum and bass, a deep drum and bass drum loop. So what I liked about this loop is that it had quite a few bleeps and percussive sounds, which I thought, could be rearranged into a drum and bass tempo, along with this other loop that I found, this hats tops loop. Now I really like this loop because it had, because of the shuffle on the hats. I think they're coming in a little bit late, not exactly on the beat, which gives the beats a nice little groove. Then there's a few other samples that I used as well to sort of that I layered on top of the those two main drum loops. So this egg shaker here, that's used throughout the entire track pretty much. This little rim shot sample I used to, I layered it on top of the snare to give it a bit more top end. Then there's this little triangle sample, which I've also used to add a little bit more variations to the drums. And finally, there's this crash, which I only really used once during the breakdown, and I've actually reversed it as well. The way I put together the drums was by taking this drum loop, warping it, which I've already enabled in here, and then cutting it into a new MIDI track. So I ended up with a whole bunch of slices because it's a little bit of a longish drum loop. Probably didn't need the whole thing. Going back to the arrangement view, I took out most of the slices and really only ended up leaving the ones that I needed. And then I've rearranged them to create something like this. All right, and there's only one sample that I've added to this drum rack, which is the little triangle sound, which is right here. Okay. Apart from that, and also on the snare, as I mentioned earlier, I ended up layering a rim shot to give the snare hits a little bit more of the top end. And you can clearly tell the difference. I'll play the drum loop first without, and then with the rim shot layered on top. So as you can see, that rim shot adds quite a bit more top end and crunch and impact, I guess, to that snare, because I felt that was lacking a little bit. That was definitely lacking, actually, on the original break. And yeah, that's really the main drum loop that I've used on the track. And I've also layered that other shaker loop. I've auto-panned it a bit to give it a bit more width, to take advantage of that stereo field. And I've also used a frequency shifter just to kind of tune the hats a little bit more, so they're in the same frequency as the, I guess, as the drum loop. And I've also added some chorus to the hats, again, to widen them up a little bit and spread them around the stereo field. So when I put my drums together, I try to stay away from putting everything straight down the middle. It's a good idea to spread your sounds around the stereo field, and by doing that, you end up with fuller, fatter sounding drums. There's also a very simple shaker loop that I've put together based on that hi-hat sample I showed you earlier. This is dead simple, just straight up loop. I didn't even bother changing the volume on the velocity on the notes, and that was just there to. It didn't really matter if it sounds a bit robotic on its own, because there's so much groove going on within the other elements of the drums that the shakers just kind of blend into the background. So the overall result sounds something like this. And you'll notice that I've also added the shakers, the triangles. And that was done because during some parts of the song, I introduced the triangles to create a bit more of a rhythmic variation to the drums, right? Otherwise, they get a little bit stale. So this is what it sounds like without and then with the triangles. So they add a nice little shuffle in there as well. That's pretty much it when it comes to the drums. Then I did quite a bit of processing on those drums, because I found that when I was originally mixing this down, I wasn't too concerned with how it sounded in terms of the mix down. I was more aiming to get the right groove and the right samples going. So the original drums without the effects sounded more like this, which is okay, but I can only really hear the kick and the snare. There doesn't seem to be a lot else going on in there. I've actually bounced the drums to audio clips to show you what happens to the various drum hits elements through the various stages of processing. So first thing I did was add a compressor. So this is what the original break sounded like, and you can see that there's pretty much just a kick and the snare, particularly the snare. It's already pretty fat in there. Once I ran the compressor through it, you can see that the other percussive elements became quite a bit louder. So let's hear the difference before and after the first compressor. That's kind of already sounding pretty much like the final break. But what I wanted to do was to get the drums sounding a little bit more even, so that you could hear all the other detail that's in there, all the other percussive elements, and not just the kick and the snare. You can see there's quite a bit of dynamic range in the clean drums, whereas in the final product, all the hits are more or less playing at roughly the same level. And so I dropped in a multi-band compressor, which further squashed the hits, and then finally a saturator. And this is what the drums sound like after adding the second multi-band compressor. So you can tell that that's brought down the overall volume of the drums. I am not actually boosting the output at all in here. It was more about just crunching all those hits and evening out the volume. And then finally I ran a saturator, which pretty much distorted the and added additional harmonics, increasing the perceived loudness of all the drum hits. And then we ended up with the final product. After adding the saturator, we end up with a waveform that looks like this, and you can now clearly hear a lot more detail in the break, and that's kind of what you're aiming for when putting together drums for your tracks. Unless you actually want your kick and your snare to really be out there, to be the main elements, having just a kick and the snare playing within the break doesn't really work. So in this particular track, I wanted to be able to hear all the percussive elements. So that's why I ended up doing that. I could have probably achieved something like this without using 3 different compressors in series, but that's just how I ended up doing the processing of the drums. The truth is, you don't have to do that with your own drums. If you can get from this to this using a single plugin, then go for it. There's really no rules here. But I was happy with the result as it was, so I decided to leave it that way. So that's it. The other thing is there's some other effects in here. I notched out the EQ at around 150 hertz, and that's because Ozone picked up that there was a little bit of resonance going on around that region, particularly when the kick hit. So I've decided to carve out a little EQ dip around that region, 150 hertz. And there's some reverb in there, but the reverb is only ever used. This particular reverb instance is only really used during the breakdown for creative effect, to just sort of seem like the drums are just fading away instead of just cutting them out suddenly. Finally, this is something I added at the very end once I listened to the drums through headphones, and it's just a very subtle reverb. It's only at 15% with a short decay time, and that's just to give the drums a little bit of ambience. Otherwise, they sounded a little bit dry, particularly during the intro. So let me show you what the drums would have sounded like without the reverb at the start of the tune. And I'm going to turn on the reverb now so you can see the difference. Let's solo out the drums. That'll highlight the difference even more. So adding that reverb in there really makes the drums sound, it gives them more of a live sound as opposed to a computer sounding drum break. That's pretty much it. That's the drums. Yeah. So now we're going to move on to how the bass for this track was put together. So let's talk about the bass now. So the bass patch that I used in this particular track came together through a happy accident, actually. Initially, I was working with a really simple 2-note bass line. There wasn't much going on in there, and it wasn't until I click on this little button and activated the LFO without actually meaning to. I was just messing around with it, and and I was quite pleased with what the LFO did. So by turning on the LFO, basically it enables pitch modulation on the oscillators within Operator, and I'll show you what the effect was when turning on the LFO on that bass patch. So as you can see, suddenly the bass just came alive. That pitch modulation added some much needed movement to the bass line and turned it into something I thought was quite funky, and it was definitely a keeper for me. Again, complete accident. Let me solo out the bass so you can actually see the effect of the LFO modulation, a pitch modulation on the bass. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Now it's a really simple bass line, as I mentioned, even with the pitch modulation in there. So what I ended up doing to add a bit of interest is to introduce some pauses in the bass line, and sometimes in places where you'd expect to hear it, and other times in unexpected places. And the whole idea here is to add a little bit more interest to the track. If the same bass line is playing all the time, it can get a bit boring. And I think that little element of surprise adds a little bit more funk and interest to the track. So just to give you an idea, I'll play the bass line after the second drop so that you can... I'll play the song after the second drop so you can hear the pauses within the bass line. So there should have really been a note here, but I took it out just to catch the listener by surprise. And also I pulled out the bass every 16 bars or so to keep things a little bit more interesting. One other thing that I did on this track that I wouldn't normally do is to take out the bass 16 bars before the breakdown. So what you typically hear within drum and bass is the bass usually keeps playing right up until the breakdown, and then it cuts out. That's kind of like the tried and tested formula. But in this case, again, I decided to leave it out just for creative effect, and I was pleased with the results. So this is what it sounds like as the tune marches towards the breakdown. yeah. So yeah, taking out the bass line 16 bars before the breakdown kind of provided a sense of that something's about to change within the track. It kind of leads to the breakdown. So I thought that was something worth doing and worth keeping. Now, in terms of the patch, it's an extremely simple patch. Even though the filter is enabled in here, it's not actually doing anything. It's just a sine wave with another smaller sine wave, a harmonic added on top. The compressor there is just doing a little bit of side chaining against the kick on the drums. I've notched out some of this EQ, some of the frequencies here, and that's to sort of tame that second harmonic. Again, I wanted the bass line to sound very deep. That's why I did that, and I've also boosted the lower frequencies, the sub frequencies within that bass line as well. And that's pretty much how the bass line came together. Now, I talked about side chaining against the kick. One thing that I did do on the drums, I did not actually layer a kick onto the original drum break, and that's something that I probably do on most of my tracks. But in this case, I didn't really ended up having to do that because I just used the kick that came with the original drum break sample that I've used and simply boosted that kick around 100 hertz to sort of give it more of a more boom and to allow it to punch through the mix a little bit more. Again, I didn't really intend for this tune to have a very heavy kick anyway, because the focus really here is on the bass line. And that's one thing I've learned recently. You cannot really have it all unless you do a bit of side chaining, a lot of side chaining actually. You cannot have a really loud kick and a really loud bass. There's typically a compromise between one and the other. In this case, I wanted to put the focus on the bass line, so the kick sort of just sits in the background a little more than it usually would. So that's why I didn't really feel that there was a need to layer any kicks on top of what was already in the break. Unlike I did with the snare was really lacking those high frequencies, so I needed to layer that ream shot. The other thing I did with the ream shot that I didn't mention earlier was that I pitched it up to 11 semitones, and that was done for a reason. I kind of played around with different pitch settings on the rim shot until I got the snap that I wanted on that snare sound. So just maybe solo that so that you can get an idea for what I'm talking about. So let's solo out the snare. Right, just the snare. So that's with the rim shot layered. So let's try different different pitches for the rim shot. Again, on its own, it probably doesn't mean much. It probably makes more sense to compare the different pitch settings against the backdrop of the full drums track. So as you can see, it's a case of trial and error. I knew that a big fat snare probably wouldn't work in terms of layering. So I thought a rim shot probably had the sort of frequency content and the kind of snap that would work better with the snare that was already there. And yeah, I ended up settling at 11 semitones, and yeah. So yeah, it's important to tune your drums like this to make sure that it fits not only well within the other drums that are there on the track, but also potentially with the key of the track itself. Sometimes producers will actually tune their kicks and their snares to actually be on the same frequency as the key of the track or the root note of the key. I didn't deliberately do that on this track, but it's something that that can help if all the elements of the track sound a bit more cohesive. So yeah, so that's pretty much the bass. There's not a lot else going on. So next we will talk about the samples that I've used, the melodic samples that I've used on the track. So you'll remember that I ended up using two melodic samples on the tune. So there's what I like to call a jazzy loop. And the vocal sample as well. Now these both these samples already came with a lot of effects, and it looks like they've also been high pass. There's not a lot of high end going on in there, which in itself is not a problem. There's plenty of high end on the drums, so that kind of balances things out a little bit, and also on the effects. So again, that sort of limited what I could do with the samples, and as you can tell, the samples are playing almost the entire time, except the vocals. And again, essentially the tune is built around playing these samples against each other, kind of like a call and response theme, right? So what I've used for creative effect here is essentially just a low pass filter to sort of bring those samples in and out throughout the arrangement. And now I figured that it would probably it probably wouldn't work if I played the vocal sample back the entire time. The track would get quite boring if that happened. There wouldn't really be much in terms of variation. So so as you can see, the vocal sample doesn't really play at all during the intro, and then there's a couple of gaps in there, just sort of in the middle of the first half of the song, and then straight after the second drop. So I've added also used delay as a way of transitioning out of the vocal sample, because if I noticed that if I just cut it out and didn't actually include that delay towards the end of the sample, it would feel as though something was missing. Suddenly, all of a sudden, something's missing. There's a hole in the track that needs to be filled with something, right? So I wanted to transition out of the vocals using delay, so that the transition isn't so sudden. So this is how the transition out of the vocals sounds like. So you can clearly hear that there's quite a bit of looping going there off the final bit of the vocal sample, and that's in there deliberately, right? For creative effect. Again, the same thing happened during other parts of the track as well. I've also doubled up some of the vocals on a separate track, which is free from effects. So I've got a different, the only reason I put it on a separate channel is because I wanted to use a different filter on that particular section, because there's already a filter on the group channel for the 2 tracks. And I wanted to process that separately. Yeah, other than that, that's the only reason why it's there. There's also something I did during the intro that I've used as an alternative to the delay effect. And I actually, instead of using delay, I just cut and pasted the last bit of the sample and then fade it out using a low pass filter, which kind of achieves the same thing, but you have more control over it. So this is what it sounds like. There's a little bit of the vocals that I put at the start of the track, which sounds kind of like an ad-lib before the main vocals. This is what it sounds like. And so the whole idea is to, again, pull out this this ad-lib whilst bringing in the main vocal loop so that it sounded something like this together. Yeah, so that's the idea behind that. Also, when taking out the vocals, I had to fill the arrangement with something else, right? So I decided to use a number of other samples, some which are basically just a few stabs. So essentially these guys here. Okay, now this is yeah. So I figured a trumpet sound would actually fit quite nicely in there, and I did audition quite a few trumpet samples until I found one that was roughly what I had in mind. I did have to edit that sample a bit because the tail end of it. So first of all, let me play you the full trumpet sample first. This is what it sounded like. So I was really only interested in this part. Or actually more like just this. No, actually this bit is what I wanted. So what I ended up doing a bit of editing on this sample, and I'll show you exactly what I did and why. So let's solo out this track here and warp it. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So I wanted to extend this bit here. I could have warped it, but it kind of distorted the sound, and I wasn't really very pleased with it. Could have probably got away with it, but instead what I decided to do was to cheat and cut out this bit, paste it again, so that we ended up with this. And then I stretch this out a little bit more. Okay, And then that wasn't the note that I wanted. That was not the note that was there in the original sample. So I just transposed it down. That was 2 semitones, and I ended up with this. And that was exactly the trumpet loop that I wanted at that point. So I just joined that together, and that's what became this. So yeah, as you can see, there was a bit of editing in there, but I was happy with the result, and I ended up with the trumpet loop that I wanted. And so this can be used not just with trumpets, but anything, but particularly vocals sometimes. I've employed that trick as well. So yeah, that was something interesting that I ended up doing on this track. Next, there's a bunch of effects, rises, swells that I ended up using. Oh yeah, and there was another bit of cheating that I did here on this particular sample, FX2. Now you notice that it's just one note throughout the entire sample, but I wanted to create a bit of a melody with it. So I chopped it, changed the pitch, and then sort of cut and paste and faded the samples in and out and changed the pitch on the different bits that I cut and paste to get the sort of melody line that I was after, and similar to what was done with the trumpet, and I ended up with this. So that kind of blends a little bit nicer into the background instead of just being a boring one-note sample. So yeah, that's another trick that I use there with cutting and pasting samples. Again, I do that quite often. You can really get very creative with that, particularly when pitching vocals. There's nothing really groundbreaking, but it's something I think is fun to do. I enjoy doing. Yeah, so the rest, in terms of the effects and rises, there's nothing really special going on in there. You know, it's easy to find these effects. There's millions of them everywhere, right? And you can make your own as well using synthesizers if you so wish. But one thing I did do on this track that was first is that I actually ran some of these effects tracks. I actually ran resonator plugins on them. And the idea is that what the resonator does is it actually highlights a particular frequency or note, I guess, tone is probably the right word, within the sample. And as the song is in the key of F sharp minor, I ended up highlighting or boosting the F sharp tone on the samples, which kind of made them in tune with the rest of the track. So I'll show you, for instance, the effect that the resonator has on this particular riser sample. So let's hear the raw version first. So it's just a jumble of noise. There's not much in terms of the tone going on in there, but look at what happens when I turn on the resonator. It's now got a tone, it's got a note, right? Which is the same as the root note of the song. So again, this helps all the various elements sound more cohesive and together within the overall mix of the track. And as the song is in a C, and again, you don't have to limit yourself to the root note of the song's key. You can also use other notes within the key as well. like typically you would use the what makes up a minor chord. It's the root note, the perfect fifth, and the minor third. In this case, I didn't really use the minor third, but I did use the perfect fifth on another effects channel, again to highlight that frequency. And next thing you know, I've now got a chord of effects, not just effects, but a chord of effects that's actually in the same key as the rest of the track. So I ended up with something like this by highlighting the C sharp on this effect. So again, this is a first one for me, but that's a neat little trick that I thought I'd show you, and it's something I'm definitely going to be using more and more on my next tracks. The other thing too that I wanted to mention here is with effects channels, it's pretty much standard procedure for me to completely drown them in effects, particularly reverb and delay. That keeps them sounding interesting. I don't really think that effects on their own, with no, that these sort of sounds on their own, risers and swells, sound very good if you just paste them, if you just use them in their dry form. So it's good to add a little bit more atmosphere and ambience to these, and I generally do that by adding a lot of reverb and delay. And you can see that most of the effects channels in here have got some degree of delay. And reverb as well. Yeah, pretty much. That shows you. And yeah, and the other thing that I wanted to show you guys is that I don't usually just put all my risers on the one track, and I like to layer these guys as well as much as I can. Sometimes layer them together, as in playing at the same time. Like sometimes I'll have a riser, one effect sample going up in frequency, whilst the other one, in pitch, whilst the other one going down, the pitch of the other sample going down. And sometimes I use auto pan to make them move around the stereo field. All of these things can help add more atmosphere to the track and also make your transitions a lot more interesting. So yes, that's pretty much the samples, the sampling component of the track. So now that we've covered these, we will now talk about the final mixdown and my referencing technique, which is something that is I think is very valuable. So let's look at that next. I tend not to worry too much about mixdowns whilst I'm composing the track. In the beginning, it's all about getting that vibe, and making sure everything's in key and all that sort of stuff. I typically do the final mixdown as a separate stage once I've got most things down. And when it's time to do the final mixdown, I always reference. And this is something that I learned early on, really, when I started producing. And I think it's absolutely invaluable. In fact, if I could give any producer one tip, it would be, out of all of my production knowledge, it would be to reference your tracks every time. So what does that mean? What that means is actually configuring your program so that you're able to use a key on the keyboard to toggle between your mix and somebody else's track. Okay. And so this allows you to see whether your track is on the level with your reference track. Now, choosing your reference track is very important. You want to make sure that it is a track that is similar style to the one you're you're writing. So, for instance, if you're writing a minimal track, you don't want to reference against a dance floor track, a drum and bass track, right? So in this case, I ended up picking an Alex Perez tune. In hindsight, I probably could have picked something that's a little bit more minimal, but I thought that would probably do. And this is my reference track. So what I ended up doing is pasting the entire reference track on a separate channel, which I call reference, or ref for short. And what I also do is I use keyboard mapping, and I map the dot key. Again, you can choose any key you want, but I don't think that I use dot because I don't think it's actually mapped to anything within Ableton. So it's pretty much convenient. It's very convenient to use that. So what I do is I map that to the solo button of the reference track. And so when I press the dot button, it automatically solos that track. Okay, the reference track. And the other thing is you want to make sure that the output of the reference track is sent to the external output, not your master bus. And this is very important because if you solo that track and you send the output to the master bus, it means it's going to pick up your master effects chain, and it's going to sound horrible. And it's going so yeah, you want to make sure you bypass your master chain, and that's how you can do that in Ableton Live. Again, with other programs, there's probably different ways of doing it, but this is something I do every single time when mixing down. So I'll show you what I mean by being able to toggle between my mix and somebody else's mix. So doing this allows you to see whether your track's really on the level that it should be, whether your drums are really hitting as hard as they should, and just whether your mix is in the neighborhood or if it needs more work before it's done. Now, I've recently started using Ozone, and I am not really a mastering engineer. I much prefer for somebody else who knows what they're doing to worry about mastering a track. However, it's important as a producer to be able to quickly throw together a master if you want to play out your tunes at a club. So one feature that I find really useful in Ozone is the referencing feature. So Ozone has its own referencing feature, which is separate from the one that I've showed you just there. And what you do basically is you load a track onto Ozone's reference channel. In this case, I loaded exactly the same track, and then you use the master assistant to compare your mix against the levels of your track versus the levels of your reference track. And what Ozone then tries to do is to actually roughly match the levels for you. So it kind of creates a mastering preset that's like a custom mastering preset for you based on the gap between your mix and your reference track's mix. So again, this doesn't always work. I've probably done a little bit of tweaking here with this particular patch in Ozone. And the other thing is I've also added an imager. So the master assistant doesn't really provide you with stereo imaging. It only does these 4 bits over here. And that was pretty much it. That's how I ended up mastering the track. Again, when using the reference function in Ozone, the main thing you need to remember is that you want to compare the loudest portion of your reference track versus the loudest portion of your track. Otherwise, it's not going to work very well. And in a nutshell, that is the track. So what I'll do now is also to close off this tutorial, I'm going to show you some of the effects that I've used on the breakdown. So this is what the breakdown sounds like. I need to turn my filter delay back on, otherwise it sounds like crap, because I'm basically removing all the effects that I put in there. So let's play it back again with the delay turned on. As you can see, that sounded quite boring, not much going on in there. But let's see what happens when we enable filtering, the filter delay. So yeah, again, I put a filter delay on send channel B with a lot of feedback. So it means that it just keeps looping that delay again and again and again. And every time it loops, it cuts out a little bit of the low end. So with each repetition, there's more and more higher frequencies, and that's what creates that sort of dubby delay sound. And during the breakdown, I've used automation to increase the amount of signal that gets sent to that send track on the vocal track, and also on the Vox doubles, the doubles track. And again, this is coupled together with a low pass filter to give that impression that the samples are just kind of melting away into the background instead of just cutting out during the breakdown. And I did a similar thing with the drums as well. So instead of playing the entire drum loop, I only played the triangle sample. And again, I applied a lot of actually, in this case, I didn't end up using the send. I just there's a reverb plugin within the actual drums group track itself, and which I touched on earlier in this video. And yeah, you can see that increases as the breakdown progresses. Again, making it seem as though all those hats and tops are sort of melting away instead of just cutting out suddenly. So which gives the breakdown a nice little atmospheric vibe. So let's hear that again. So that's it, guys. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.
Yo, we're Galaxy and we're a drum and bass duo from the UK. Have been for 9 years and we've been signed to Shogun Audio since 2017.
Since then, we've released our debut album, Research and Development, and a handful of other EPs.
We've put this course together for DNB Academy, covering our whole process of writing a drum and bass tune from start to finish.
So we give you an insight into our process and specifics of drum production, sound design, melodic ideas, and sources of inspiration, including some samples as well. And ending with a mixing and mastering session to get your tunes ready for release and to play out in the clubs. This is Galaxy, and you're watching our drum and bass masterclass for DNB Academy.